The movie was completely exhausting because Robin never quit. We would do a take 1, 2, and 3. We got it. It's all done. Perfect. Done. Except Robin would go, wait a minute. Let's try. How about...
She sat backstage at the 2023 Screen Actors Guild Awards, being celebrated for a lifetime of work, and instead of talking about herself, she started talking about a man who had been dead for 9 years. That is the moment that tells you everything about what Robin Williams actually meant to Sally Field. Not a co-star. Not a scene partner. Something closer to family, forged on one of the most chaotic film sets in Hollywood history, and carried quietly, almost secretly, for 3 decades afterward. For most of the public, Sally Field and Robin Williams exist together in one place, a rented house in San Francisco, a fat suit, a British accent, and a divorced father disguised as an elderly nanny so he could stay close to his own children. Mrs. Doubtfire, released in 1993, is remembered as a comedy, one of the biggest of its decade. What almost nobody knew, for more than 20 years, was that behind the wig and the improvised jokes, one of the film's stars was going through the worst week of her adult life, and the other one quietly rearranged an entire production schedule to protect her from having to face it in front of a crew. That story did not come out for decades. And to understand why Sally Field waited so long to tell it, and why it means as much as it does, you have to go back much further than a soundstage in the early 90s. You have to go back to a house in Pasadena, California, where a little girl was already learning how to survive by pretending everything was fine. Sally Margaret Field was born there in November of 1946, the daughter of an army officer and an actress. Her parents divorced when she was young, and her mother remarried a stuntman and actor named Jock Mahoney, a charismatic, larger-than-life figure who friends and colleagues genuinely adored. In public, he was magnetic. At home, according to Field's own 2018 memoir, In Pieces, he was something else entirely. In that book, Field described years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, beginning in childhood and continuing into her early teens. She wrote about it not for shock value, but because she had spent most of her adult life not writing about it, not saying it, burying it under the discipline of an acting career built, in part, on the very skill of performing a feeling she did not have. There is another layer to the Pasadena years worth sitting with, because it explains so much of what came later. Much of Sally Field's early childhood was spent not in her mother's house at all, but in her grandmother's house nearby, a place she has described as a genuine refuge, shared with an aunt and a great-grandmother, during a period of constant upheaval everywhere else. That grandmother had her own hard history, born to unmarried parents and raised partly in an orphanage in the American South, a resilience that seems to have passed down the family line long before Sally Field's own story began. It is worth remembering that context, because it complicates the easy narrative of a broken childhood. There was real safety available to her, just not always where it was supposed to be, and not always for long enough. That instability, bouncing between a dangerous home and a safe one, taught her early to read a room, to sense which version of herself was needed and produce it instantly. It is a survival skill many actors will recognize, and one that came at a steep personal cost. That skill started early. By the time she was a teenager, Field had already learned that showing real anger or real sadness in her household was unwelcome. The safer path was to be cheerful, funny, easy to be around. It is not a coincidence that her first major role, at 18 years old, was the title character in Gidget, a sunny, bubbly surfer girl beloved by television audiences in 1965. Nor is it a coincidence that her second defining role was the Flying Nun, a role she has said for years she took reluctantly, partly because a family member warned her that turning it down could end her career before it began. Those 2 shows made Sally Field famous before she was 20. They also nearly buried her as a serious actress. For most of the late 1960s and early 1970s, casting directors saw Gidget and the Flying Nun and refused to consider her for anything with weight or complexity. Rather than accept that verdict, Field enrolled at the Actors Studio, training under the legendary Lee Strasberg, doing the unglamorous, unpaid work of relearning her craft while the industry still saw her as a teenage sitcom face. It was there, years later, that a fellow student, Jack Nicholson, recommended her to a casting director for a small role in the 1976 film Stay Hungry, alongside Jeff Bridges and Arnold Schwarzenegger. That tiny part became the first crack in the wall. That same instinct for adapting to survive followed her into her first marriage, entered into as a teenager under pressure from a partner who reportedly threatened to leave if she said no. 2 sons, Peter and Eli, arrived quickly, and Field has spoken about finishing an exhausting final season of The Flying Nun while pregnant, working through physical and emotional exhaustion because there was no framework yet, in that era, for an actress to simply say she needed rest. It is a small detail, but it says something larger about the decade she spent learning, slowly and often painfully, that her own needs were allowed to matter. The real turning point came a few years later, through an unlikely source, Burt Reynolds, who called her in personally to help fix a script he thought was in trouble. That project became Smokey and the Bandit, filmed in 1977, and it launched both a hit film and a long, complicated relationship between Field and Reynolds. In interviews and in her memoir, Field has been candid that the relationship echoed some of the same dynamics she grew up with, a partner who could be charming and warm, and also controlling in ways that eventually became suffocating. The breaking point, by her own account, came over a film Reynolds did not want her to make, Norma Rae, the story of a real-life textile worker turned union organizer, built around a character's difficult, complicated personal history that Reynolds reportedly objected to strongly. She took the role anyway. It won her the first of 2 Academy Awards, in 1980, and it marked the beginning of her walking away from the relationship for good. By the time she stood on that stage accepting the award, she has said the entire experience felt like a blur, a kind of emotional numbness rather than pure joy, the reaction of someone who had spent so long fighting to be taken seriously that the moment of actually winning almost did not register. 5 years later, accepting a second Oscar for Places in the Heart, something had shifted. She let herself feel at that time, which is part of why the speech came out raw and unfiltered rather than polished, and part of why 4 decades later, people still argue about what she actually meant by the line that followed her for the rest of her career. She was not describing vanity. She was describing disbelief, spoken out loud, almost to herself, in front of millions of people who mostly heard something else entirely. By the time the 1990s arrived, Sally Field was no longer the girl from Gidget. She was one of the most respected dramatic actresses of her generation. And then, in 1993, she was cast opposite Robin Williams in a comedy about a father who dresses as a woman to see his kids. By all accounts, working with Williams was one of the purest joys of her career. He was famously incapable of doing a scene the same way twice. Directors and co-stars from that era have described take after take spiraling into improvisation, Williams chasing one more idea, one more voice, one more joke, long after the scripted version had already been captured. For Field, playing the more grounded, exasperated half of the central relationship, it meant a set defined by genuine laughter, the kind that does not translate fully to film no matter how many takes make the final cut. But partway through filming, Sally Field's father, who had already suffered one stroke and was living in a care facility, suffered a second, far more serious one. The news reached her by phone during a break in shooting, while she was sitting in a trailer parked outside the courthouse set built for the film. She was faced, almost immediately, with the kind of decision no child wants to make for a parent, and she chose not to prolong life support. Then, according to her own account years later, she went back to work. The scene waiting for her that day involved children being separated from their father during a bitter divorce, a story uncomfortably close to her own childhood of shuttled custody and fractured homes. She has said she did not tell anyone what had happened. Not the director. Not the crew. She simply went back in front of the camera and did the work, holding the news of her father's death privately while performing a scene about a family coming apart. It was Robin Williams, not the director, who noticed something was wrong. Between takes, he pulled her aside quietly and asked if she was actually okay. That single, gentle question was enough to break weeks, maybe a lifetime, of practiced composure. She told him what had happened only hours earlier. And Williams, without hesitation, ended the shooting day right there, sending the crew home and clearing space for her to grieve rather than pushing forward for the sake of a schedule that could easily wait. That alone would be a moving story about one actor's kindness to another. But what Sally Field revealed decades later, in an oral history conversation about the film published through Vanity Fair, went further than a single act of compassion on one difficult afternoon. She said that Williams had quietly gone back and reworked the production schedule for that entire stretch of filming, shifting scenes and adjusting the workload around her, specifically to make that period easier, without ever telling the studio or the rest of the crew why he was doing it. He carried that decision privately, absorbing whatever friction it caused behind the scenes, so that his co-star would never have to explain herself or ask for special treatment while she was quietly falling apart. For years, nobody outside a small circle knew any of this. Sally Field did not use it publicly after Williams' death in August of 2014, when she was one of many actors who released a statement mourning him, describing shock and profound sadness at the loss of a man whose gift for making people laugh had touched an entire generation. She did not use it at award shows when his name inevitably came up in tributes to a golden era of comedy. She kept it, seemingly, as something personal, a private kindness that belonged to the two of them and did not need to be turned into a headline. It surfaced only gradually, first in fragments during that 2023 Screen Actors Guild ceremony, where cameras caught her growing visibly emotional discussing him on the red carpet, saying their friendship remained full of love and joy even years after his death, and voicing a simple, aching wish that he could still be here, growing older alongside the rest of his generation of performers. Then, more fully, the account of the schedule change during Mrs. Doubtfire reached a wider audience, adding a new, deeply human dimension to a friendship the public had already admired from a distance for 30 years. What makes the story land so hard is not just the kindness itself, though that would be enough. It is the shape of it. Here was a woman who spent her childhood learning to hide real pain behind a bright, easy performance, because showing the truth at home had never been safe. And here, decades later, on a film set of all places, was someone who noticed the performance cracking and did not look away. Robin Williams did not demand an explanation. He did not make it about himself, and he did not make a public show of his generosity. He simply changed what he could change, quietly, and let her keep whatever privacy she needed. For a woman who had spent a lifetime being watched, categorized, and misunderstood, from the surfer girl to the Flying Nun to the two-time Oscar winner accused of vanity for a line about being liked, that kind of quiet, undemanding kindness may have been rarer than any award she ever won. It also explains why the grief did not fade the way public grief so often does. A decade after his death, Sally Field was still visibly moved discussing him, not performing sorrow for cameras, but carrying something real. Their friendship, born on a set built around laughter and disguise, turned out to rest on a foundation of exactly the opposite: honesty, noticed pain, and a choice, made privately by one performer for another, to make things a little easier during the worst week of her life. Sally Field's story does not end with Robin Williams, of course. It continues through Steel Magnolias in 1989, filmed alongside Dolly Parton, Shirley MacLaine, and Julia Roberts on a set remembered for its warmth. It continues through her sons, Peter, Eli, and Sam, each of whom built careers of their own around storytelling. It continues through a television storyline on brothers and sisters that let her draw on her real relationship with an adult gay son, and through the 2018 memoir that finally said in public what she had spent a lifetime avoiding in private. Grandparenting, she has said in later interviews, did not arrive with the instant, automatic devotion people often describe. It took real, ongoing effort, the same kind of effort she had to learn to apply to parenting itself after growing up without a reliable model for what safe love looked like. That is perhaps the quiet thread running underneath this entire story. Nothing about safety or trust ever came easily to Sally Field, and every version of it in her life, with her sons, with her grandchildren, and for one particular stretch of weeks in 1993, with Robin Williams, had to be built, deliberately, by someone willing to show up for her without asking for anything back. But of everything she has said and written across more than 60 years in public life, the story of that one afternoon on the Mrs. Doubtfire set may be the one that reveals her most clearly. Not the Oscar-winning dramatic actress. Not the sitcom star who fought her way out of typecasting. Just a woman who had spent her whole life learning to hide her pain well, finally being seen by someone who chose, quietly and without any need for credit, to make the hiding a little less necessary. That, in the end, is the truth Sally Field finally told about Robin Williams. Not that he was funny, though he was, and not that he was talented, though the world already knew that. It is that he was kind in the way that matters most, when no one else is watching, and he expected nothing in return.